Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this free webinar on Brexit, which we're offering as a part of IGD's charity activity. And according to our screen here today, we have about 200 people online. So hello, wherever you are. The aim of this webinar is to provide you initially with a very brief update on latest Brexit developments. Secondly, I want to identify some of the key issues and risks for grocery businesses. And finally, I'm going to suggest 10 activities that grocery professionals can do now to prepare for the possibility of a no deal Brexit. Now, the structured content of this webinar is going to last about 35 minutes, but most of that time we've allocated to item number 3 because we want to keep the webinar really practical, really actionable. There's going to be time at the end for Q&A, and you can submit your questions anonymously via the webinar platform. We'll see them on our screen. My colleague John Wolven is joining us today, and between us, we're going to answer as many questions as we can. And if you're listening to the recorded version, today is 29th of January 2019. So Brexit is only 2 months away now, and we still, unfortunately, have no idea exactly what form Brexit might take. But we'll start off with a review of some of the recent events. So all of the coverage you're about to see is up to date as of the live webinar. But as we know, events associated with Brexit do tend to develop very quickly. So if you're listening to the recorded version, things may well have moved on in the interim. That's just something to be mindful of. A Brexit withdrawal agreement, which details the Brexit process, was agreed by the UK and the EU back in November last year. Now, this deal couples the decoupling only. It's very important to recognise that the withdrawal arrangement is not a trade deal. The trade deal will be a separate negotiation, which is yet to begin. However, if we do have a smooth withdrawal from the EU, that would presumably make agreeing a trade deal much, much easier. That draft agreement was subjected to Commons vote on the 15th of January, and it was rejected. It was rejected by a very large majority. It's back in Parliament today with amendments submitted by Parliament. And today's activity is an opportunity for MPs to air their concerns and to test a few possible solutions that might be able to command a majority. At the moment there, it's still not clear that any of those amendments is likely to pass. And the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland is likely to remain the key sticking point for UK politicians. It's really hard to see how the needs of the two sides in the negotiation can really be reconciled on this very important matter. And this isn't just a political issue. The food industry itself also has a really deep interest in managing that border in particular, because the food supply chains of the UK and Ireland are really closely intertwined, and huge volumes of food are crossing the border in both directions. So Brexit prep is an Irish concern as well as a UK concern. The rejection of the Brexit agreement, however, doesn't halt or delay Brexit. For the moment, Brexit is still on track for the 29th of March 2019. What the rejection does do is increase the likelihood that Brexit will occur with no deal. And a no deal would mean no exit agreement. It would mean no transition period to delay the impact. And it would mean the UK becoming a third country as far as the EU is concerned, with new trade barriers starting to spring up between the two blocs. Those barriers don't necessarily mean a full shutdown in trade. Nobody's talking at the moment about, a movement to wartime conditions. But what it would mean, almost inevitably, is trade between the UK and EU becoming more difficult and more expensive. And it seems at the moment that there is very little political headroom on the EU side for material changes to the Brexit agreement. And in any case, the time that is left to implement and agree any changes is very, very short now. It is still possible that we will see quite a range of outcomes. We could still see delays or a deal or even a new referendum. But for the moment, I think food businesses on both sides have to be ready as far as they can be for a no deal Brexit. That sort of no deal preparation could cover an awful lot of ground, but building up local stocks in the UK of imported food and drinks seems to be the most popular response. I mean, this is certainly what grocery businesses are talking about in the media, and we've also picked this up in our own industry research. Unfortunately, however, there is no central repository for food stocks data or utilization of food storage. So it's very difficult to know exactly how much food storage is going on. But anecdotally, we understand that most food storage facilities are currently at full utilization. That is definitely unusual for the time of year. Now, stock building is obviously an attractive proposition, but it does raise a whole series of really practical challenges for the businesses involved. Certainly, it's a massive financial commitment, and tying up working capital at the end of the financial year is obviously not something that you do lightly. And of course, stock building doesn't work for everybody. Yes, you can store ambient, yes, you can store frozen for quite long periods, but you can't store the chilled and the fresh. That was a point that M&S made earlier this month. And in any case, any stockpile is going to be finite. It can only ever be a short-term fix for Brexit disruption. And a really lasting, a really robust solution can only really come from government or from officials. Potentially, we might see storage happening at a household level as well. And you may have heard that a lot of businesses in the UK, well, some businesses in the UK are selling what they're calling Brexit boxes or Brexit preparation kits for shoppers. Our own shopper research, though, suggests that stockpiling at home for Brexit is currently a fairly niche activity. So only about 3% of British households say explicitly that they are preparing for Brexit in this way. Although it is possible that there is a larger group that is perhaps doing so subconsciously. So they might be putting just a few extra cans in the trolley every week, or perhaps they're stockpiling, but they don't want to say so openly. It is clear, though, that stockpiling is something that you can switch on and off very readily as a shopper, and it could prove to be an infectious activity. So if people sense that their neighbours are preparing for Brexit with a food stockpile, they might choose to do so as well. So a lot is going to depend on the messages that people get from their businesses and from government, and the confidence that they have that those messages are correct. So what sort of issues and risks do we think that a no deal Brexit might present? Start off by taking a fairly broad view. If we exit the EU on bad terms, that would likely mean quite broad and quite serious economic and fiscal shocks. And I've listed on this chart some of the possible risks, although certainly I don't think that this chart is anything like comprehensive. Managing all of that stuff would be a tough test for any UK government, and it wouldn't be a one-off test because the economic effects would probably linger for some years. In the long term, we can envisage a possible positive outcome from Brexit as far as the UK is concerned, but that benefit could be very far away. In the short to medium term, the net effect of all of these changes is more likely to be negative for the UK economy. So they're likely to depress national economic performance. And if the economic effect is negative, well, certainly that would drive down shopper incomes. It would drive down shopper confidence for some years into the future. And that's certainly something to consider when you develop your business plans for the next couple of years. If we focus in on the food and drink industry specifically, we can start to see why a no deal Brexit would be problematic. At the moment, about 60% of the food that we eat in the UK is produced here, and that's shown on the chart by the orange line. And even for what they call indigenous type foods, so foods that we can grow for ourselves, it's still only 75%. So there's a high dependence here on imported supplies of food and drink. And anything that blocks or slows down that trade would be a challenge, not just for businesses, but probably for our shoppers as well. If we look at it from a shopper point of view, I think we can identify two key Brexit food challenges. One is price, one is availability. If we turn to price first of all, price could certainly be affected by tariffs. Tariffs are effectively import taxes. They are actually intended to drive up the price of imported foods. At the moment, we don't charge tariffs on food and drink that we import from the EU or from some nations that the EU has trade deals with. We do charge tariffs on imports of food from other nations. If we leave the EU with no deal and no trade deal, the UK may well choose to start charging tariffs on those imports from the EU. For the moment, we don't know how big those tariffs might be. The UK government has still not published a schedule of agreed tariffs, although we are expecting that in February. In theory, we could charge zero tariff in this country and unilaterally open up the food trade, although that would reduce our leverage in any future negotiation. The latest news we have, though, is that the UK government will broadly mirror tariffs charged by the EU if it comes down to it. And so to give you some idea of what those tariffs might look like, I've taken this set of EU tariffs for the food and drink market. The dark blue bars are showing you food and drink tariffs. The orange bars are showing you tariffs for other things that our industry requires. What we can see from this set of tariffs is that although the EU is relatively open to international trade, food and drink is actually an exception to that general policy. The EU does actually charge quite high tariffs on imports of food and drink. And don't forget, of course, that in addition to the tariffs, further supply chain costs could come from things like currency changes or interruptions to cash flow, new admin costs, or just supply and demand. We know that when things are in short supply, the price of those things does tend to go up. So price is one of the challenges that might communicate through to our shoppers. Availability is the other one. That's the other major Brexit risk to UK food shoppers, because Brexit increases the danger that there will be delay at the UK border, or as the jargon says, friction at the border. Modern supply chains, we know, particularly for food and drink, tend to be run on just-in-time basis. So we have limited stock holding in the supply chain. So we're vulnerable to anything that tends to interrupt that flow, particularly fresh foods, where the shelf lives of products are so short. And remember, border delays would perhaps happen in both directions. Any new delay at the border might be particularly tedious for our HGV drivers, because they might face a delay getting into the UK and a delay getting out again as well. And if those problems are sustained, it may be that EU drivers will not want to come to deliver food and drink to the UK. And don't forget that we do have a long-standing shortage of HGV drivers in this country. Another key thing to bear in mind, not shopper-facing, but business-facing, is the question of legal and regulatory uncertainty in the aftermath of a no deal Brexit. And that could arise for a couple of reasons. Certainly, we know that some EU member states might take a very different view of implementing EU rules after Brexit. We might see conflicts over interpretation between EU member states and the EU Commission. Again, how do they treat the UK after Brexit? And it's not clear how any pre-EU treaties might be revived in the aftermath of Brexit. So, for example, the UK has some quite complex treaty relationships with Ireland. At the moment, those are superseded by EU membership, but they might reassert once we drop out. We might also start to see commercial or civil disputes as a result of Brexit. So one question that a number of people have raised with us is, does Brexit count as an act of God? Is it a force majeure that might release businesses from their long-standing contractual or commercial commitments? We don't know. Views on this really up in the air, and it's not clear even which courts might have jurisdiction if disputes start to go international. But really, whatever happens behind the scenes within our supply chain probably only matters for businesses. The government, interest groups, the media, they're not likely to worry very much about business performance. But what they will be interested in is the shopper outcome. Any issue with availability could manifest in store very, very quickly. Again, the just-in-time supply chain, which is usually a strength, could prove to be a vulnerability in this situation. And media coverage of Brexit might leave our shoppers especially sensitized to any availability problems that come up. Availability would be very obvious, very easy for shoppers to judge, particularly in fresh produce, which is very vulnerable to disruption. In a lot of stores that I shop in, the fresh produce is actually close to the door. It's the first thing you see when you go in. You don't even have to go into the store in some cases to start to form a judgment as to what availability is like. And if shoppers do see that food availability is restricted after Brexit, they may be stoical, or they might be scared. They might just shrug and tut and adjust their shopping list and carry on shopping, or they could be sparked into new and dynamic shopping behaviors. As I said, a lot of it is going to depend on the messages that they get from industry and the level of trust that they have in those messages. So I promised that I would conclude with a series of practical actions that grocery businesses can take right now to start to prepare for a possible no deal Brexit. Now, this bit is technical and it might be heavy going. And in fact, it is probably going to be heavy going. Sorry about that. All of these things are aimed at businesses that are currently importing food or drink from the EU. At the moment, that doesn't require very much import admin because we are within the single market. We are within the customs union. But if we get a no deal Brexit, we will drop out of those arrangements. So a lot of UK businesses, maybe tens of thousands, will have to start doing this admin for the first time. And even those that are quite seasoned when it comes to import admin will have to scale up what they do. So it's important to know about this stuff either way. Getting the import admin and the compliance right is honestly not terribly interesting for a lot of us, but it is terribly important. Brexit is going to be a massive challenge for border staff. There'll be a high risk of confusion, high risk of conflict, and high risk of delay. Businesses have got to do everything they can do to make it possible for officials to say yes and let a shipment pass over the border. It's all about making it easy for the officials to wave vehicles through. And getting the details right could be the difference between getting a truck or container in or having it turned away, especially if you're importing a complicated load, like a mixed load of products, or if you're sharing a vehicle with other people, because everything will have to be covered by the right paperwork. Otherwise, the whole shipment might be held up, which is a daunting prospect. On the upside, there are government grants now available to pay for any new IT or any new staff training that you need. SMEs and people who are completing that import paperwork for the first time are probably going to find this especially valuable. And it is free money. In fact, a higher level of grant is going to be made available to SMEs particularly. So activity number one to get ready for a no deal Brexit is to apply for grants and training. There is a deadline here of April 2019, so you will need to get your skates on. The scheme is being administered by government, so full government by PwC. So if you just Google PwC IT and training grants Brexit, you will be sent to the right page. Now let's start to think about some of those admin tasks themselves. These already apply to goods coming into the UK from beyond the EU. After Brexit, this stuff will apply to EU goods as well, or might apply to EU goods as well. So activity number two is to apply for what's called an EORI number. That's Economic Operator Registration and Identification. And this is a special code number that's used to identify a business for import purposes. The numbers are free. You get them on request from HMRC, and it takes about 3 days. You can do it electronically. But what HMRC have said is that they think hundreds of thousands of UK businesses will need an EORI for the first time after Brexit under no deal. But so far, only a very small proportion have actually applied for one. And this really could be an issue. Even if your business has got one, Some of your supply chain partners might not. So it is definitely time to check up. You only need one, even if you've got multiple locations in the UK. But if you operate across several different countries, you will need a different one for each country. And before applying, very important to check you haven't got one already. So to help, you can use the special HMRC helpline and just make sure that nobody's jumped the gun and done it for you. EORI numbers are what you need to access the UK import control system. So if you're a first-time user of that system, an EORI number is what you need to access the UK import control system. So again, if you are a first-time user, you've got to enroll before you use it. That's activity number 3. Again, you can enroll online, but the procedure is going to differ depending on whether you're based in the UK or based somewhere else. You use this ICS system to make an electronic entry summary declaration, and you have to be able to do that before your goods arrive at the border. All goods are covered, even if they're going on to another location. And the data that you provide in the ENS is used to assess the risk that your shipment might present. The level of notice you have to give will vary according to the mode of travel. So if it's for a container arriving by sea, you've got to give at least 24 hours notice before your container is actually loaded onto the ship. If it's other modes of travel, less notice is needed. So if it's a truck arriving by ferry, for example, you've only got to give 2 hours notice, but you do still have to give notice. CDS, this is the Customs Declaration Service. This is the new IT system for HMRC. It handles both imports and exports. It calculates tariffs, calculates VAT, and it's also used for trade statistics. Now, if you're an importer, CDS is going to replace the older system, which is called Chief, from early 2019. So you may already be a user of this, otherwise you will be soon. Introduction for exports a few weeks later. As I said, you may already be enrolled with CDS, so it is worth checking first. But if you don't, if you're not using it, you will need to get on board, and that is activity number 4. You can only do this via the government gateway, so you need a government gateway ID and password before you start. Worth noting, by the way, that CDS was specified before Brexit actually came onto the agenda. It has been upgraded because the government is anticipating more traffic as a result of Brexit. But the Public Accounts Committee is expressing a lot of concern over whether it's actually going to be ready. So what's going to happen is that CDS and the old system, Chief, are going to be run in parallel until CDS is proven to be working. Activity number 5, get familiar with your import documentation. And I'm thinking particularly of what's called the Single Administrative Document, the SAD, or the Form C88. Now, the Form C88 is used to declare goods to customs for tax purposes, and you have to have a new C88 for every import transaction. It's nearly always electronic rather than a paper form, but it is quite long. So there's 8 different sections. There are 54 boxes to get involved with, although you won't necessarily have to use all of them for any single shipment. And what's on the SAD, the C88, is firstly what the goods are, secondly how you're moving them, thirdly the commodity code, which is used to calculate the tariff, and fourthly the customs procedure code, which tells customs how to treat your stuff. All of that information will remain relevant and necessary whatever happens after Brexit. So you need to start getting familiar with this material right now. The commodity code is a 10-digit number, and it classifies your imports very, very precisely. It's 8 digits for exports, 10 digits for imports. And there are thousands of possible commodity codes, so you've got to get it exactly right. That's activity number 6. Sounds easy, but finding the right number isn't always obvious, especially if it's a very complicated or a very innovative product. And a really good example from the last couple of years is smartphones. Until quite recently, there was no specific tariff code for smartphones. So if you were an importer, you were left with a real conundrum. So should you classify it as a phone? Is it a computer? Is it a camera? Or what? You could argue it either way. To help you with this, HMRC has a searchable database, But do bear in mind that the codes can change from year to year, so you do need to stay up to date. If you're not sure which code applies to your products, you can get help from the Tariff Classification Service. You can phone them up or contact them via the internet. And if all else fails, you can apply for what's called a binding tariff information decision. This is a written statement saying legally what tariff code attaches to your product. That will clear up any remaining confusion. Tariffs are usually calculated on what's called the ad valorem basis. So it's going to be a percentage of the value of your goods. And obviously VAT always is. So to complete your SAD, your Form CAD8, you've got to value your goods. That's activity number 7. And just to make things really confusing, there are at least 6 different ways of valuing your goods for tariff purposes. But for most products, and certainly most grocery products, method number 1 is going to be the default, and that's based on the invoice price. There are really rigid HMRC rules giving you a clear breakdown of what you can include and what you mustn't. But do remember, you are going to need evidence either way. You have to be able to prove why you have valued your goods as you have valued them. So do keep all of your evidence handy. And if you deal in other currencies, you'll have to convert everything into sterling. And again, HMRC will specify what exchange rates you've got to use. Once you've done all of that for the first time, you can start to assess what sort of financial and competitive impact Brexit is really having. If you're an importer, you're also going to have to start complying with rules of origin for the first time. That's activity number 8. Rules of origin are used to determine where your products are coming from for tax and legal purposes. And that could be really important. So for example, if we have a free trade deal with another country, maybe kiwi fruit from New Zealand, we would have to be able to prove that goods actually do come from that country in order to take advantage of the deal. For some items, it's fairly straightforward. So a kiwi fruit grown in New Zealand almost certainly comes from New Zealand. But for a lot of more complicated products, that is a real challenge. And again, there are very clear rules laid down which determine where complex products are deemed to originate. So any processing which is done, which changes your tariff classification or which increases the value of your goods, is likely to change the origin of your product for legal purposes. Now, food and drink raise special issues for importers of goods because of the possible risks to health and to safety. At the moment, we treat the entire EU as a single regulatory zone. So goods are inspected for safety and compliance as they come into the EU, but once they're inside, they circulate freely. If we get a no deal Brexit, the UK would fall out of that arrangement. The government has said that for the moment, it won't treat imports that originate in the EU differently to how it does today, even under no deal. So in most cases, it will still be a simple document check. That should help to manage border friction in the short term, but it's not clear how long this special helpful treatment is actually going to last. But we must still expect that there will be more border inspections under no deal, because the shipments that come from outside the EU, which are currently being checked and processed somewhere else, would probably have to be checked and processed at entry to the UK. The government has said it will increase its capacity to do border inspections to compensate for that. But anyway, it's probably prudent to allow for more delays and more admin challenges at the border. The current rules divide food imports into 2 broad groups. You've got products of animal origin, which is the POAO, and that's usually treated at high risk. And you've got food not of animal origin, which is FNAO, so normally treated as being slightly lower risk. At the moment, if you're an importer and you want to bring POAO, the animal foods, into the EU, you've got to register with a system called Traces. And Traces is used to record the health data of the product and to track it around the EU. As we leave the EU, we're going to drop out of the Traces system, so it will be no longer available to UK businesses. A new UK only system is currently being created. It's being tested right now, although I don't know what it's actually called, haven't been able to find that out. Latest news suggests that whatever it is going to be ready in March. So it's going to be touch and go whether it's ready in time for Brexit. But when it is ready, importers of animal products will have to register with it very, very quickly. It will be broadly similar to traces. That's a deliberate procedure, but you will have to enroll with it again. Leaving the EU will also mean that we can't use the EU plant passport scheme. That would mean that anyone importing plants or plant products to the UK would have to use a different system. The system already exists. It's called Peach, provided by DEFRA. But to enroll with it, again, you've got to get to it through the government gateway. So activity number 9 to prepare for a no deal Brexit is to affiliate to the health and safety computer systems which are appropriate for your products. And finally, activity number 10. This is one that can be delegated to a certain degree, but it doesn't mean that businesses can abdicate responsibility completely. With us inside the EU, moving goods over borders is actually pretty easy. So an EU license for a vehicle operator would allow for international movements within the Union. Leaving the EU would probably create new admin challenges for transport operators and for hauliers who want to cross over borders. And I've shown here a list of possible issues, although again, I don't think this list is fully comprehensive. The government has said that for a while it will recognise EU authorisations and certifications, and the EU has made similar statements. But these promises, these reassurances are actually quite vague. We don't know how long any grace period is going to last. So if you're a grocery business, you've got to make sure that your own vehicle fleet and any transport services that you use are compliant with new rules as they emerge. There is a lot there to get into, and it's all got to be done ideally by the 29th of March. And that's why we've restricted this list of preparation activities to the 10 absolute essentials that we think will be needed to make business flow. It all seems onerous, and to be honest, it probably is going to be onerous and very, very complicated too. But it's critical to get engaged now. Definitely refer to the government's guidance on Brexit, which I referred to earlier, and you can find that by Googling Brexit technical notes. And you can also start to look at the Cabinet Office Brexit Gateway, which is now starting to be populated. And as always, do consult with your own subject experts, like your customs agents, for example, if you have any technical issues. So that's the end of the prepared content. I'm going to move on now to questions, and I can see that we've actually had several questions already. Still time for you to submit more if you want to. We'll get through as many as we can. My colleague John Wolfen is with me right now, and we're going to get cracking. So John, would you like to go first?
Yes, I'll give you a little break there, James. I've been waiting in the wings to help answer questions. Lots of them, as James says, we'll answer as many as we can, but where we can't, or where we need to do a little bit of research to answer them, we will write them up and we'll circulate them to everyone. So start off with, we've had some questions about tariffs and the policy behind the UK government's tariffs. Now, the difficulty here, of course, is that they haven't been published yet. This is causing significant difficulties for food companies to work without that knowledge. It has been delayed in terms of when we were originally told that they would be published. And to be honest, I'm not sure that the Cabinet has even agreed on this. It is politically debatable. We know there are different views in Cabinet, and that probably explains largely why there's been a delay. As we run closer and closer to the clock, then it becomes more likely, I think, that we will just replicate the EU schedule on tariffs, because that is the path of least resistance in order to implement. As James was saying earlier, that may not necessarily be the case. We could reduce some of our tariffs. I think we would be in difficulty if we tried to raise them above any of the existing EU tariffs. That's likely to cause complaints into the WTO. Someone has said, could it be that the government just doesn't charge those tariffs for a period of time? If it decides to do that, then under WTO rules, it would have to do that across the board. It couldn't discriminate in favour of EU imports on that basis once we have left the EU and if we don't have a trade agreement in place. So I suppose it's possible that that might happen, but I think it's unlikely. I think it's much more likely that we will continue with uniform tariffs. Someone has asked about how the EU tariff compares with WTO. WTO doesn't have a list of tariffs. It's really about rules that underpin the setting of tariffs, such as I said earlier, about how you have to treat all companies, all countries equally, unless you have a trade agreement in place. I'll move on to another one, which is people asking about shoppers stockpiling food and what trends we are seeing as far as that one's concerned. We've been tracking this since September. We've been, as part of our regular shopper research, asking shoppers to tell us, A, whether they are stockpiling food already, B, whether they are considering stockpiling food. And somewhat surprisingly, we've seen very little change to those numbers since September. So it seems that the public are not that easily spooked by the political news that they're hearing. So it is only about 3% of shoppers self-reporting that they're stockpiling. We're looking at this on a weekly basis. We've not seen anything odd yet in January, but as James was saying earlier, we could reach a sudden tipping point. It's something that could move quite rapidly.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions here about businesses that use agencies or brokers to help them negotiate the customs minefield. These guys really are experts, but the question is, does your business have to enroll with ICS or have an EORI number if you use these agencies? Now, my understanding on this is that you will still need to have a company identity in order to continue importing after Brexit if we have no deal. So if you haven't got an EORI number now, you will need to apply for one. However, the agencies use those numbers on your behalf when they actually negotiate the paperwork. And just as an aside to that, it is worth actually going back to any agencies or customs brokers that you have and actually just asking them some very pointed questions. Are you going to be ready for no deal? What would my company have to do to help you deal with no deal? And really start to get your money's worth from your agents by actually asking them the difficult questions. And worth taking the same approach to any IT or software companies that you're using to help you with importing. Are they going to be ready? Will they have to make any changes to deal with no deal Brexit? Ask them, find out now, know for sure.
Okay, there's a question here about what plans the government have to minimise disruption at ports. Few points to make here. First of all, it's to try and make sure that companies are as ready as possible with the sort of things that we've been talking about today. So the government is launching a publicity campaign about getting ready for Brexit, focusing particularly on SMEs, where the feeling is that many of those are not yet ready. So look out for more government materials on that. Secondly, they'll be looking to do things offline as far as possible, by which I mean not actually checks and administration at the border, to be getting people to register things online up front and do the administration that way. There may be scope, rather than holding vehicles at the border at Dover, say, to do checks there, to move them into a holding area which is slightly away from the border. I have heard discussions about that being floated, but nothing concrete on that. And then rerouting, so that the flow of vehicles. So the expectation is that it is Dover, the Channel Tunnel, that are most vulnerable to bottlenecks here. So the more that goods could flow, if they can, through other ports, the better. So they will be hoping that some products that are currently roll on, roll off, in other words, on accompanied trucks driving over on ferries or the Channel Tunnel, that some of those will be routed through other ports, through containers, if they are not short shelf life critical.
Okay. One here on VAT. Up until fairly recently, there was some concern that VAT after Brexit would have to be paid on goods brought in from the EU, and that would have to be paid in advance. So you'd have to pay upfront as the vehicle comes over the UK border. My understanding is the latest guidance we've had from the government is that VAT on imports from the EU, if there is no deal, will be paid in arrears rather than upfront. So it will still be payable, but fortunately the cash flow impact of paying upfront won't hit us. Another question here about Smart Border 2.0 research for the Northern Ireland border. Some research was actually done on this by the Northern Ireland Select Committee last year, in the early part of last year, and they came to the conclusion that no technology currently exists which would offer a full management solution to the Northern Ireland border. It is possible that such a solution could be evolved over time, but the opportunity to do so before Brexit happens on the 29th of March is obviously, well, it doesn't really seem to be very realistic. So a technical solution is possible, and other borders in the world are managed with a great deal of technology, a good example being USA, Canada. But at the moment, I'm not aware that any package is in preparation.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions here. The first is our view on the letter that was published yesterday under the auspices of the BRC, a letter to government about the potential impacts of a no deal Brexit. Now, clearly, the retailers have been rather reluctant to get too involved in an area that is politically controversial, but they have seen the sort of risks that we've been talking about today. On our website, there's a more detailed paper that we have about the risks of a no-deal Brexit. And I think the particular concerns are a no-deal Brexit without sufficient time to prepare adequately for it. So I'm not too surprised that the retailers have chosen this moment to speak up, and it will be interesting to see how many other voices join this over the next few weeks if we are still at the danger of no deal. Second question I've got here is, how long do we believe we have as a grace period before the need to change any packaging? A really good question, and I think there's not certainty over this. So we are expecting some guidance to be issued by the Food Standards Agency on this quite soon, within the next couple of weeks. There's a difference, of course, between imported and exported products. So the UK, I am guessing, will take a somewhat relaxed view in terms of strict packaging regulations for a brief period of time, provided the contravention is not flagrant and doesn't risk consumer safety, of course. What we don't know is how European governments will interpret this, whether they will follow them to the letter or whether they will also be pragmatic. At a guess, we can imagine the Irish government will be quite pragmatic, very much in its interest to do so. Some of the other countries may be a bit more sticklers for the rules, and it could depend on how good the relationships are between the UK government and some of those other countries as a result of the Brexit process at that stage.
Right. Another question, just carrying on this question of food standards and what sort of standards might apply for food imports after Brexit. I think we can probably take some guidance in terms of what the government will expect from how we currently treat imports from outside the EU. So if we're bringing in stuff from outside the EU, the country itself has to be recognised as a safe source. The facilities that the food is coming from must also be recognised as a safe source, and the food must be accompanied by a veterinary certificate. Now, we don't apply all of those things to food, all of those checks and tests to food coming in from the EU, because it is assumed that all EU food production facilities are run to the same standards as we have in the UK. As we leave the EU, a lot is going to depend on the sort of relationships that we leave with. And one of the key questions that we're going to be looking at is mutual recognition of standards. This is what some people have called the common rule book for food production. The government has indicated that it won't carry out new checks and tests of food as it comes in from the EU for the time being, based upon the assumption that, you know, EU produced food is recognized as being safe now. There's no reason for that to change in future, but a lot is going to depend on whether we have some sort of food shock. So if, for example, there were, you know, an outbreak of some sort of animal disease in Europe after Brexit, well, that might actually be a good reason to start clamping down and checking the standards on EU food imports much more rigorously. So overall, I wouldn't expect an abrupt change until it is required as a health measure, if you like. But a lot is going to depend on shock events, which are obviously very hard for us to judge or predict in advance. And I've probably got time for just one more question before we finish.
Okay, well, a couple of people have asked us just how long the delays might be at the ports. Way back in when I was studying my degree, I looked at queuing theory. It was the most mind-boggling branch of mathematics that I've ever known. It is really extremely difficult to model. There are too many variables. What we do know is just a relatively short delay per vehicle proceeding through customs will lead to very long tailbacks, queues awaiting the ports. We've seen both the Port of Calais and the Port of Dover releasing figures on that. So in a worst case scenario, there could be really severe delays. Someone's asked whether there will be a process to accelerate clearance through for certain short life products. Unfortunately, I don't think so, because this is so difficult to manage on the ground. If you've got a lot of vehicles that are queuing on the motorways, for instance, you know, the biggest challenge is getting things ahead in that queue. And there's such a complexity of different product types. The policing on that on the ground will be just too difficult. So I can't see an easy solution for short shelf life projects emerging anytime soon. So we do need to close. It has turned 1 o'clock. Thanks everybody for all of those questions. Quite a few that we didn't get to, but just to remind you, we will look at those, we will write them up, and we will circulate our answers to those.
Okay, so I think really it is time to wrap. I hope that you found all of that material interesting and actionable. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for staying the course, and please enjoy the rest of your day.